And so that happened. And amazingly enough, back in December, I get some contact from a person at the Center for Naval Leadership, was letting me know that they're still teaching my model, that he just loves teaching that block of instruction and has a great time with it, and loved it so much that he had to go out and he found my book and bought several copies and shared them with folks. So that takes us to the book. After the U.S. Navy adopted it, and I'm sitting there going, okay, maybe we do have something here. Let's see about writing a book. So I sat down, and a friend of mine connected me with a publisher, Advantage Media Group out of Charleston, South Carolina. And we had some discussions. They said, we'd love to publish your book, and we want to have a meeting with you, and we'd like you to show up with your manuscript written. And I'm going, okay, great. I don't have a manuscript written. I've been doing presentations on it for 2 or 3 years, so I knew the stuff by heart. I had all the stories that I tended to tell. So I sat down and started vigorously writing this book and trying to get it all captured on paper. And in the meantime, we were moving from Florida to Macon, Georgia. And we were in the middle of all of this, and I only got about halfway through. And so I showed up at the publisher's meeting. I only had half the manuscript, and they looked at everything and went, wow, this is great. You get this finished, and we're set. But that didn't happen. I literally, things stopped for an entire year because we had to finish selling a couple of houses, get moved up here, buy a house, get moved in, and it was many months after that finally some things happened. And I said, look, I've got to get this done. And so I sat down and I spent another week. I spent 2 or 3 days reading over the first part, then spent about 4 or 5 days writing the second part, and a couple more days polishing it all up. Sent it all off to my publisher. They went, okay, wow, this is great. And off we were, and a few months later, we finally had the final book published. And I got to give a great shout out to George there, who is their graphics designer. I said, look, the medicine wheel is very ancient, it's very old, but the research is very new, and it's all modern. And it's this coming together of the old and the new. And he gave us a cover that I just absolutely love, and it does. It stands out when it's sitting on somebody's bookcase. It really does. And so the title of the book is Leadership Lessons from the Medicine Wheel, the 7 Elements of High Performance. Don't be confused. Don't be think it's about medicine or healthcare or anything like that. It is not. It is about organizational performance and taking the medicine wheel, which we go into more detail about in the introduction, and explain what's going on with the medicine wheel and what it's all about, because it's not religion. It's just a philosophical concept of about life, and it works with other religions. It doesn't put down any other religions. It's just, how do you look at life, and how do we look at each other as people? And from there, taking and walking you through the 7 elements. And you might get a Cherokee story or two, but you're also going to get some real-world stories about things that are happening in organizations to bring to life some of those details about the 7 elements and how to bring them to life in your organization.
Very quickly, let's talk about other things that you've learned about the model, because you have taken 14 years, over 1,600 research documents reviewed. Very quickly, what have you learned about culture?
Well, the really neat thing about culture is if you take the model, you look at the model, you draw a line horizontally across it. Culture we define as how we do things around here. It's the simplest definition, and other people use it as well, and it really is a good definition to talk about what is culture without having to get too hung up in details. But how we do things is sort of divided into two things. It's the actual things and the processes in which we're doing things, and then how we relate to each other as we're doing them. And so if you draw that horizontal line across the model, you'll see at the top is more about the process stuff. That's where innovation resides. That's where personal responsibility resides. That's where the goal side of the vision resides. And that's where the mastery side of strengths reside. And so that's all about finding better ways to do things, making sure that we move the processes through, keeping up high quality, and doing things better, faster, cheaper, better, and maintaining that quality. The bottom side of the model deals with how we interrelate with each other. So that's dealing with the leadership and creating emotional connections. It's the vision part of the purpose and values, why we exist and how we're going to interact with each other. It's the trust foundation. Mm-hmm. And it's the positive part of the strengths and accentuate the positive. And so it's all how we're interacting with each other. It's all how we're the ways that we're getting the things done. It's that interaction that's part of it. And you combine them together, and what gives you culture. And there's a really neat link between what we found with culture and how those things work with culture, and a model that we've developed around leadership and management, and how management really fits in with all of this.
Perfect. Talk to me briefly about the submodels.
Okay, well, we found each one of the 7 elements has its own little submodel. So trust, we found there's 4 behaviors that build trust. So there's you need to be straightforward, you need to be open, you need to be accepting, and you need to be reliable. We found some really neat relationships with those 4 things. We use another model. We call it whole person dynamics because it's more than just the DISC model that William Marston created back in 1928. But he created this model around behavioral styles. That's dominance, influence, steadiness, and conscientiousness. And that model works very well with our whole person dynamics of the 4 aspects of the people, of individuals, which is their spiritual, their emotional, their physical, and their mental. And we really talk about that. It's really important because most organizations are looking at what people can do for them and what knowledge do you bring to the table. And they don't want to deal with emotions, and they don't want to deal with spirituality because they think that's all messy. But what the research has said is that employee engagement is all about emotions, and it's about getting connected to something that's bigger than themselves, and that the organization is actually doing something. What we talk about is there's 3 key emotions that are interrelated with the 4 elements that are comprising employee engagement, and those emotions are right relationships, doing good work, and empowerment. And that comes out of these 4 elements that we found that actually drive employee engagement.
Nice.
So those 4 elements are, and employee engagement has become this really horrid topic out in the business world because there's so much misinformation going on around it. People misquote the research that has been done, and people get really confused about all of this. And it doesn't have to be confusing. What we found is that there's 4 elements that actually work together to get employees engaged. Three of them actually come out of some work. It was popularized by Daniel Pink in his book Drive, but everything that was in his book actually comes out of a body of research that got started in the late 70s and early 1980s by Edward Deci, and it's called self-determination theory. So Daniel Pink called it autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Deci calls it autonomy, competency, and relatedness. And essentially, we're talking about personal responsibility, strengths, and vision, which is the purpose, values, and goals. But we found that in organizations, this is a motivation theory. What motivates people, and in self-motivation, those three things might be enough. But when you start putting people in a work environment where we're really interacting with a lot of folks, and we have people that, for good or bad, have authority over us, then what we end up seeing is there has to be another element that comes into play, and that's trust. So if trust doesn't exist, nothing else does. So when you bring trust into play, now you end up getting these four elements, and when you sort of connect them together in the model, they create a diamond. But what we found is that you have to work through these in a particular order. So you have to begin with trust, and then you have to start connecting people to the vision of the organization. And now you can start connecting them back between the vision back over to what they do for their work and the talents that they bring to the table. And then as you develop those talents and they start becoming masters of what they're doing, you're now able to give them more and more personal responsibility and begin to empower them.
Okay.
And so that relationship, that set of relationships. And when we ended the book, I said that there were going to be some relationships between the elements that were going to be driving some stuff, and we were beginning to look at some of those, and we were wanted to learn more about them. And that was one of the key ones that we learned, is that when we could put those four things together, we could now create employee engagement. And when we knew now those three things give organizations some very specific things to work on for their managers to make things happen.
And that leads us into percentages. It leads us into what we talked about the other day, which was, how do you quantify all of this? What makes it worth it?
And that was one of the next things that we ended up finding out about was Gallup has done a lot of research on employee engagement. They're not the only ones that have done research. There are many others, but Gallup has done a lot of research on this. And they tend to talk about three kinds of people: the engaged, the unengaged, and the actively disengaged. And there's some variations across the various organizations when they start talking about how many people fit into each category. But a lot of times when we see Gallup post what they've got, those are tracking polls. They're just like the political polls, and it's what's going on at that particular time. And they're calling people at random. We looked at a lot of their data and some other people's data on actually what was going on in organizations. What were the makeups of the people in the organization? So it's very specific to where the organization was performing and what kind of makeup of people they had.